Most men at Harbor 12 straightened their uniforms when an admiral arrived. That morning, an admiral stopped an entire naval inspection because of one old ring. Cold wind rolled off the gray Atlantic and swept across Dockyard 7 with the smell of salt, diesel, and wet steel. The massive destroyer sitting beside the pier groaned softly against its mooring lines while gulls circled above the cranes like drifting scraps of paper. Sailors moved in sharp lines across the concrete, boots striking the dock in steady rhythm as inspection teams flooded the base before sunrise. Every clipboard mattered that morning. Every uniform crease mattered. Every misplaced tool could end a career. Lieutenant Connor Hayes walked through the dockyard with the hard confidence of a man who had recently been given authority and intended to prove he deserved it. At 32 years old, he carried himself like polished brass, clean haircut, pressed uniform, jaw tight enough to crack stone. He checked cargo manifests with clipped efficiency while chiefs and civilian contractors hurried to stay out of his way. Above the harbor, a distant foghorn rolled through the cold air like thunder buried beneath the sea. "Move it!" Connor snapped toward a pair of deck workers dragging equipment crates too slowly across the painted loading zone. The Admiral lands in 40 minutes. Nervous energy spread across the dockyard like static. Admiral Nathan Rees was not known for second chances. Stories about his inspections traveled through the fleet faster than deployment rumors. Sailors whispered that he could spot rust on a bolt from 20 feet away. Others claimed he once noticed a missing insignia pin during a ceremony, with 300 men standing in formation. Whether the stories were true no longer mattered. Men believed them, and belief changed behavior. Connor adjusted the cuff of his uniform and scanned the loading gate again, just as an aging pickup truck rattled toward the security checkpoint. The truck looked older than half the sailors on the pier. Rust lined the wheel wells. The dark blue paint had long since faded beneath years of sun and ocean air. Behind the wheel sat an elderly man wearing a weathered brown jacket and a faded navy cap that had nearly turned gray with age. He drove slowly, carefully, as if every movement had purpose. Connor frowned immediately. The timing could not have been worse. The truck stopped beside the inspection barricade with a squeal of tired brakes. The old man stepped out stiffly, tall despite the years resting heavily across his shoulders. His white hair shifted in the harbor wind while he reached carefully into the passenger seat and lifted out a rectangular metal box about 2 feet long. It looked old enough to belong in a museum storage room. Scratches covered the faded green surface, and one corner carried black scorch marks that time had never erased. Connor walked over fast. "Dockyards under active inspection," he said sharply. "Civilian deliveries were cut off an hour ago." The old man looked at him calmly. Pale blue eyes. Quiet eyes. The kind that didn't move around much. "Not a delivery," he answered. His voice sounded rough like gravel under boots. "I was told to bring this personally." Connor glanced at the metal case. "To who?" The old man paused for half a second before answering. "Naval Archives." Connor exhaled impatiently and motioned toward the security table. "Open it." Nearby sailors slowed down just enough to watch without appearing obvious. The harbor wind rattled loose chains hanging from a crane overhead. Somewhere farther down the pier, a welder's torch hissed against steel. The old man set the box down carefully on the inspection table. Not nervous, not defensive, just precise. Connor noticed that immediately and disliked it for reasons he couldn't explain. Most civilians became uncomfortable around military authority. This man didn't. "Name?" Connor asked. "Elias Mercer." Connor typed it into his tablet. Nothing special appeared on the screen. No clearance. No flags. No priority notation. Just an old civilian record attached to a shipping authorization approved 3 weeks earlier. Connor's irritation deepened. "You picked a hell of a morning to wander into a restricted dockyard, Mr. Mercer." Elias said nothing. Wind swept across the pier again, tugging lightly at the brim of his faded navy cap while the steel-gray ocean churned behind him. Connor stared at the old metal case for another second while harbor wind hissed across the pier and rattled loose cables against a loading crane overhead. Around them, sailors kept moving, but slower now, stealing quick glances toward the checkpoint before pretending to focus on their duties again. The tension across Dockyard 7 had sharpened since dawn. Every minute mattered. Every interruption felt personal. Connor tapped the inspection table with 2 fingers. "Open it." Elias Mercer rested one weathered hand on the lid for a moment before releasing the rusted side latches. Metal clicked softly beneath the wind. The sound seemed strangely heavy in the cold morning air. When the lid lifted, the smell of old paper, machine oil, and sea salt drifted out faintly, like something sealed away for decades. Inside sat a folded navy jacket protected beneath clear plastic, several worn photographs bound with a faded blue ribbon, a brass compass darkened by age, and a small velvet pouch resting carefully in the corner. Connor frowned immediately. "This is what held up my inspection," he muttered. He reached down and lifted one of the photographs without asking permission. The image showed a group of young sailors standing beside a submarine, pier sometime long before digital cameras existed. Black and white, grainy, wind blowing through uniforms. One face had been marked lightly with pencil years ago. Connor barely glanced at it before setting the photograph aside again. "Looks like antique store leftovers," he said. Elias did not react. That calm expression never changed. It bothered Connor more every second. Most men his age either apologized too much or grew defensive around military personnel. This old man did neither. He simply stood there with quiet patience while gulls cried somewhere beyond the harbor fog. Connor opened the velvet pouch next. A gold ring slid into his palm beneath the gray dockyard light. Heavy, thick, scratched by years of wear. An engraved insignia rested at the center, nearly rubbed smooth with time. Connor turned it between his fingers. "Never seen this crest before." Elias finally spoke. "Most people have not." Connor smirked faintly. "That's supposed to impress me?" No answer. Only silence again. Connor slipped the ring back onto the table carelessly beside the photographs. The old metal surface scraped beneath it with a sharp little sound that made Elias glance downward for the first time. It was subtle, barely visible, but Connor noticed it. The old man cared about that ring. Before Connor could speak again, footsteps approached from the adjacent loading lane. Senior Chief Walter Brennan crossed toward the checkpoint, carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. Brennan was nearing retirement himself, broad-shouldered despite his age, with silver hair cropped tight against his scalp and deep lines carved around his eyes from decades at sea. He looked irritated until his eyes drifted toward the inspection table. Then he stopped walking entirely. Connor noticed the change instantly. Brennan's expression tightened. Not confusion. Recognition. The senior chief stared directly at the ring sitting on the scratched steel table while the harbor wind pulled lightly at the sleeve of his uniform jacket. For a brief second, the entire dockyard noise seemed to fade beneath the distant cry of gulls and the low groan of ships against their moorings. Brennan stepped closer slowly. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. Connor answered before Elias could speak. "Belongs to him." Brennan ignored Connor completely. His eyes never left the ring. Then he looked up at Elias Mercer. The old sailor met his stare calmly. No smile. No introduction. Just a long, silent recognition that passed between two men shaped by the same ocean decades apart. Brennan straightened instinctively. Not fully. Just enough for Connor to notice. "Sir," Brennan said softly. Connor blinked. The word landed strangely in the cold air. Brennan cleared his throat immediately afterward, as if he regretted saying it out loud. Connor frowned harder now. "Senior Chief, you know this insignia?" Brennan hesitated. For the first time since Connor had worked under him, the old chief looked genuinely unsettled. He picked up the ring carefully with both hands, studying the faded engraving along. The inner band. The color slowly drained from his face. Then, without another word, he handed the ring back to Elias and reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. Connor took one irritated step forward. "Senior Chief, what is going on?" Brennan did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Elias Mercer another second before he finally spoke into the radio in a low, controlled voice. "Control, this is Brennan at Dockyard 7. Static crackled softly through the speaker. I need confirmation on Admiral Reeves' arrival time." Connor stared at him in disbelief. "You are calling the Admiral over a ring?" Brennan looked at Connor with an expression colder than the Atlantic wind sweeping across the pier. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you need to stop talking right now." The wind coming off the harbor seemed colder after Senior Chief Brennan spoke those words. Lieutenant Connor Hayes stood motionless beside the inspection table while the old radio on Brennan's shoulder crackled with static. Forklifts continued moving cargo farther down the pier, but the atmosphere around the checkpoint had shifted completely. Sailors passing nearby lowered their voices instinctively. Something invisible had entered the dockyard. Something heavier than rank. Brennan listened quietly for several seconds before answering the radio again. Understood. His tone remained controlled, but Connor noticed the stiffness in his posture now. The old chief looked toward Elias Mercer once more, then glanced down the pier where gray Navy vehicles waited near the command building. Admiral Reeves just entered the base, Brennan said. Connor rubbed tension from his jaw. That inspection starts in less than 20 minutes. Brennan gave a slow nod. I know exactly when it starts. Connor lowered his voice. Then maybe we should stop wasting time over old memorabilia. The words hung in the cold air longer than Connor intended. Brennan turned toward him carefully. The expression in the senior chief's eyes no longer carried irritation. It carried warning. Lieutenant, he said quietly, there are things in this Navy that never make it into training manuals. Connor folded his arms. With respect, Senior Chief, I am responsible for this checkpoint until the Admiral arrives. Then I suggest you start acting carefully. Connor looked back toward Elias. The old veteran remained calm beside the table, one weathered hand resting lightly near the ring. No anger, no pride, just patience that somehow made the younger officer more uncomfortable by the second. Harbor fog drifted slowly between the cranes behind them, while distant ship horns echoed across dark water. Somewhere overhead, a helicopter moved through low cloud cover with a dull mechanical thump that rolled over the dockyard like distant thunder. Connor exhaled sharply. Fine, he said. Then somebody explain why an old civilian walks into a restricted inspection carrying an unidentified insignia, and suddenly everyone starts acting like ghosts walked off a submarine. Brennan stayed silent. That silence irritated Connor even more. He reached toward the metal case again, lifting another photograph from inside. This one showed a younger Elias standing beside several sailors in heavy cold weather gear. Ice covered the railings behind them. One man in the picture had his arm around Elias's shoulder. His face had been partially damaged by water stains, but a naval commander's insignia remained visible on the coat collar. Connor studied it briefly. No unit markings, he muttered. No ship identification. Brennan's eyes narrowed immediately. Put that back. Connor looked up. What? Now? The sharpness in Brennan's voice surprised both nearby sailors and Connor himself. The younger officer slowly lowered the photograph onto the table again. Elias still said nothing. Wind tugged at the brim of his faded Navy cap, while dock lights reflected faintly in his pale eyes. He looked less like a confused civilian now and more like a man standing inside memories nobody else understood. Then footsteps approached from the adjacent supply corridor. Emily Carter emerged carrying a stack of logistics folders against her chest. Mid-30s, civilian analyst, sharp-eyed and observant in ways most officers overlooked. She slowed immediately when she noticed the tension gathered around the checkpoint. Everything. All right, she asked carefully. Connor answered without looking at her. Routine delay. Emily's eyes drifted toward the open metal case, then toward the old photographs, then finally toward the ring resting near Elias's hand. Her expression changed slightly. Not recognition exactly. Curiosity. That insignia looks familiar, she said quietly. Brennan turned toward her instantly. You have seen it before? Emily hesitated. Maybe. She looked closer without touching the ring. There is a framed photograph in the old administration hallway near archive storage. Basement level. I remember seeing something similar on a uniform patch. Connor frowned. Archive storage. Emily nodded slowly. Very old photograph. Black and white. Brennan's face tightened immediately. He looked back toward Elias Mercer again, and this time the old chief's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Dear God. Connor stepped closer. What? Brennan ignored him completely. His eyes remained fixed on the ring while harbor wind swept across the dockyard once more. Then the distant sound of approaching engines rolled across the pier. Black command vehicles were entering Dockyard 7. The black command vehicles rolled slowly across the dockyard like armored shadows cutting through sea fog. Their headlights reflected off wet concrete, while sailors across Dockyard 7 straightened instinctively at the sight. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forklifts stopped moving. Even the gulls circling above seemed quieter against the cold Atlantic sky. Lieutenant Connor Hayes felt his pulse tighten immediately. Admiral Nathan Reeves had arrived earlier than scheduled. Connor adjusted his uniform collar and looked sharply toward Elias Mercer. "This ends now," he muttered under his breath. He stepped closer to the inspection table and began closing the metal case himself. "Sir, you're going to need to take your belongings and clear the checkpoint immediately." Elias remained still beside the table. "I was told this delivery mattered." Connor snapped the lid shut harder than necessary. "And I am telling you the Admiral does not need civilians wandering around his inspection route." Senior Chief Brennan opened his mouth as if preparing to intervene, but Connor spoke first. "With respect, Senior Chief, I am not delaying a 4-star inspection over an old photograph and a mystery ring." Brennan's jaw tightened. Emily Carter looked between them uneasily while Harbor Wind swept loose paper across the loading zone nearby. The command vehicle stopped roughly 70 yards away beside the main pier entrance. Doors opened in quick sequence. Naval officers stepped out first, followed by security personnel and senior command staff carrying tablets and briefing folders. Then Admiral Nathan Reeves emerged from the center vehicle. Tall, silver-haired, immaculate white uniform beneath a dark overcoat that shifted in the wind. He moved with the calm precision of a man who no longer needed to prove authority because authority followed him naturally. Sailors standing across the dockyard immediately snapped to attention. Connor straightened instinctively. "All right," he said quietly toward Elias. "You need to move now." But Elias Mercer did not move. Not stubbornly, not confrontationally. He simply watched the harbor beyond the pier for a long moment as cold wind brushed across his faded Navy cap. There was something distant in his expression now, like a man hearing echoes no one else could hear. Brennan leaned slightly toward Connor. "Lieutenant," he said carefully, "do not make this worse." Connor turned sharply. "Worse than what?" Brennan lowered his voice. "You still do not understand what you are standing next to." Connor looked back toward the approaching command group. Admiral Reeves and his officers were already moving down the inspection lane, reviewing equipment stations as they advanced toward Dockyard 7. Every sailor they passed stood straighter. Every officer answered faster. The pressure moving across the base felt almost physical. Connor took a slow breath. "Fine," he said. "Then tell me." Brennan glanced once toward Elias before answering. 30 years ago, I worked archive security during a classified transfer at Norfolk." His voice had become quieter than the harbor wind itself. "I saw that insignia once before." Connor frowned. "From where?" Brennan hesitated. "A sealed naval citation." Emily looked up immediately. "Sealed?" Brennan nodded slowly. "Highest level clearance." Connor stared at him. "For a ring." Brennan looked directly into his eyes now. "For the men who wore it." The younger officer felt irritation mixing with something else for the first time. Unease. Behind them, the command procession continued moving closer through the dockyard. The metallic echo of polished shoes against concrete carried through the cold air in measured rhythm. Emily crossed her arms against the wind and looked toward Elias again. "Why would someone like him bring this here now?" she asked softly. Elias answered before Brennan could speak. "Because the Navy asked for it back." Connor turned toward him immediately. "Who asked?" Elias looked down at the closed metal case resting beneath his hand. "A letter came 3 weeks ago." His rough voice carried no bitterness. "Archive Division. Said they were reorganizing historical records." Brennan's expression darkened. "They should never have touched those files." Connor rubbed tension from his forehead. "You are all acting like this man walked out of some classified ghost story." Brennan did not blink. Maybe he did. Then the dockyard speakers crackled overhead. Attention on deck. Every conversation stopped instantly. Admiral Reeves had entered Dockyard 7. Connor stood rigid beside the checkpoint while the command group advanced through rows of sailors and steel-gray equipment beneath the heavy Atlantic sky. 40 yards away now. 30. 20. And then Admiral Reeves suddenly slowed his pace. His eyes had locked onto the old metal case sitting beside Elias Mercer. The entire dockyard seemed to hold its breath as Admiral Nathan Reeves stopped walking. Cold harbor wind moved through rows of sailors standing at attention, while the command staff behind him slowed in confusion. No one spoke. The only sound came from distant waves striking steel pilings beneath the pier and the low metallic groan of the destroyer moored beside Dockyard 7. Lieutenant Connor Hayes felt his stomach tighten immediately. Admirals did not stop inspections without reason. Reeves stood, motionless roughly 20 feet from the checkpoint, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the old metal case resting beside Elias Mercer. More specifically, fixed on the ring lying near the edge of the inspection table. Connor straightened harder. "Admiral on deck," someone called across the dockyard. Every sailor nearby locked rigid. Admiral Reeves barely seemed to hear it. He stepped forward slowly now, polished shoes striking concrete in measured rhythm. The officers following him exchanged uncertain glances but continued behind him in silence. Connor swallowed once and stepped toward the Admiral. "Sir," he began carefully. "Minor civilian delay at the checkpoint. We are clearing it now." Reeves raised one hand slightly without taking his eyes off the table. Connor stopped speaking instantly. The Admiral moved closer until he stood directly across from Elias Mercer. For several long seconds, neither man said a word. Wind pulled lightly at the Admiral's dark overcoat while gulls drifted overhead against the gray Atlantic sky. Elias looked back at him calmly beneath the faded brim of his Navy cap. Then Admiral Reeves looked down at the ring. Connor noticed something change in the Admiral's face immediately. Not shock, something deeper. Recognition buried beneath years of discipline. Reeves reached toward the table slowly, but stopped just short of touching the ring itself. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Elias answered in the same calm tone he had used all morning. "It was given to me a long time ago." Reeves looked up sharply. Their eyes met again. Then the Admiral spoke words nobody around the checkpoint expected to hear. "Who are you?" The dockyard fell even quieter somehow. Connor stared in disbelief. Senior Chief Brennan lowered his gaze immediately. Emily Carter remained frozen beside the checkpoint folders pressed against her chest. Elias Mercer rested one hand near the closed metal case. "My name is Elias Mercer, sir." Admiral Reeves continued studying him carefully. The harbor wind carried the smell of salt water and cold steel through the silence stretching across the pier. Then Reeves noticed the old photograph still resting partly exposed near the edge of the case. He picked it up carefully. Connor watched the Admiral's eyes move across the faded black and white image, across the frozen submarine pier, across the young sailors standing shoulder to shoulder beneath heavy winter gear, and finally across the partially damaged face beside Elias Mercer. Reeves went completely still. A command officer behind him spoke cautiously. "Sir." Reeves ignored him. Very slowly, the Admiral lowered the photograph and looked back toward Elias. "I have seen this picture before," he said quietly. Elias gave a faint nod. "I figured you might." Connor looked between them in growing confusion. "Admiral, is there a security issue here?" Reeves did not answer immediately. His attention remained locked on the old veteran standing before him. Then something happened that nobody in Dockyard 7 would forget for the rest of their careers. Admiral Nathan Reeves took one slow step backward and came to full attention. The movement was sharp enough to cut through the harbor air like steel. Sailors across the pier watched in stunned silence. Connor felt his pulse stumble. Then the Admiral raised his hand in a formal salute toward Elias Mercer. Not ceremonial, not casual, precise, deeply personal. The dockyard froze completely. Even the senior officers behind Reeves looked shocked. Elias stared at the Admiral for a moment before quietly returning the salute with the same calm dignity he had carried all morning. Wind swept between them as the two men lowered their hands. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Admiral Reeves turned slightly toward his command staff, his expression colder now than the Atlantic fog rolling across the harbor. "This inspection is suspended immediately," he said. Connor blinked hard. "Sir." Reeves looked directly at him for the first time. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said calmly, "you will stand down from this checkpoint." Connor felt every eye in Dockyard 7 turn toward him at once. The Admiral's voice never rose. That somehow made it heavier. Reeves looked back toward Elias Mercer again. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "I believe the Navy owes you an apology." No one in Dockyard 7 moved after Admiral Reeves spoke. The cold Atlantic wind swept through the pier in long, steady gusts, carrying the smell of seawater and diesel between rows of silent sailors. Lieutenant Connor Hayes stood frozen beside the checkpoint while command officers exchanged uneasy glances behind the Admiral. Even the metallic clatter from nearby loading crews had faded into the distance. It felt as though the entire dockyard had stepped into another time. Admiral Reeves lowered his salute slowly and looked toward the old metal case again. His expression had changed completely now. The sharp inspection posture remained, but something more personal sat behind his eyes. Respect. The kind that could not be ordered through rank. Elias Mercer rested one hand lightly against the worn green lid. "You recognize the insignia," he said quietly. Reeves gave a slow nod. "My father showed it to me once when I was 12 years old." Connor looked between them, still trying to understand what had just happened. "Sir," he said carefully, "what exactly is that ring?" Reeves turned toward the younger officer. The harbor wind shifted his overcoat slightly as gray clouds moved low above the Atlantic. "There are operations this country never discusses publicly," the Admiral said. "Not because they did not matter. Because some missions were considered too dangerous to officially exist." Connor stayed silent. Reeves looked back at the ring. Ghost Squadron 7. Even Brennan lowered his eyes hearing the name spoken aloud. Emily Carter felt a chill move across her arms despite the thick harbor jacket wrapped around her shoulders. Connor frowned slightly. "I have never heard of it." "You were never supposed to," Reeves answered. The Admiral stepped closer to the inspection table and carefully picked up the faded photograph again. His thumb brushed lightly across the damaged image of the sailors standing beside the submarine pier. "Winter of 1983, he said quietly. "North Atlantic operation during the Cold War." Harbor wind howled softly between the steel structures around them, while Reeves continued staring at the photograph. Officially, several naval vessels experienced severe communication failures during a storm system near Greenland. He paused briefly. Unofficially, an unidentified reactor malfunction nearly destroyed an entire submarine task group beneath the ice. Connor felt the tension around the checkpoint deepen. Reeves looked toward Elias Mercer again. Ghost Squadron 7 was sent into conditions no one else would enter. The old veteran said nothing. His pale eyes remained fixed on the harbor beyond the dockyard, as if the ocean itself carried memories he could still hear. Reeves continued quietly. Temperatures dropped below 30 degrees. Visibility near zero. Navigation systems failed repeatedly beneath the ice shelf. The Admiral's voice remained controlled, but every sailor listening nearby had gone completely still now. One submarine lost power entirely under the polar drift. Emily swallowed softly. "What happened?" Reeves looked down at the ring resting in his hand. "Command ordered withdrawal." Then he glanced toward Elias Mercer. But one sailor refused to leave the damaged vessel behind. Connor slowly looked toward the old man standing beside the checkpoint table. Reeves spoke again. "The mission logs were sealed for national security reasons. Most names disappeared into archive storage." The Admiral paused while distant foghorns rolled across the Atlantic beyond the pier. "But my father never forgot the man who kept 43 sailors alive beneath frozen water." Silence settled across Dockyard 7 again. Wind rattled chains against a nearby crane while gulls drifted through the gray sky overhead. Connor stared at Elias Mercer differently now. The old jacket, the quiet voice, the weathered hands resting against the metal case. Suddenly none of it looked ordinary anymore. Reeves carefully placed the photograph back onto the table. "My father said there was one thing every survivor remembered," he said quietly. "During the reactor failure, when panic spread through the compartment, one man remained calm enough to guide everyone home." Elias finally spoke again, his voice rough like distant gravel beneath waves. "A lot of good sailors got through that storm." Reeves gave a faint nod. "Because you made certain they did." The Admiral looked toward the closed metal case. "And after all these years, the Navy sent you a letter asking for your records back like you were cleaning out an old storage locker." For the first time, a faint sadness crossed Elias Mercer's face. Not anger. Something quieter than that. "Most people forgot long ago," he answered. Reeves stared at him for several long seconds before speaking softly enough that only those nearest the checkpoint could hear. "Some of us did not." The silence hanging over Dockyard 7 no longer felt tense. It felt reverent. Sailors who had spent the morning rushing through inspection protocols now stood perfectly still beneath the cold Atlantic sky, watching an old man beside a worn metal case, while one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy spoke to him with quiet respect. Lieutenant Connor Hayes could barely process the change unfolding around him. Less than an hour earlier, Elias Mercer had looked like nothing more than another aging civilian wandering into restricted space at the wrong time. Now even commanders seemed careful around him. Admiral Reeves slowly removed his gloves against the harbor wind and looked toward the gray water stretching beyond the pier. My father talked about you exactly twice in his entire life, he said softly. Elias remained silent. Reeves gave a faint smile that carried more memory than amusement. That was enough. Connor glanced toward Brennan, but even the senior chief kept his eyes lowered now. Emily Carter stood quietly near the checkpoint table, holding her folders against her chest while the distant cry of gulls drifted through heavy sea fog overhead. Reeves looked down at the old photograph again. Commander Daniel Reeves, he said quietly, almost to himself. He was 29 years old during the Greenland incident. Elias nodded once. Young officer. Smart kid. A faint laugh escaped the Admiral before disappearing into the wind. He became my father 6 years later. Connor stared at the Admiral. Reeves continued speaking without looking away from the photograph. When I was growing up, my father never discussed classified operations. Not once. The Admiral paused briefly. But every winter, he took this photograph out of a locked drawer. The wind shifted harder across the dockyard, carrying the smell of seawater through the steel framework surrounding the pier. Reeves carefully touched the damaged edge of the old picture. He said there was one man aboard that submarine who never raised his voice. Even when systems failed, even when panic spread. Connor slowly looked toward Elias again. The old veteran remained calm beside the checkpoint, hands resting lightly near the metal case as though none of this attention belonged to him. Reeves spoke again. My father said the compartment lights kept flickering while freezing water leaked through damaged seals. His voice lowered slightly beneath the distant groan of ships against their moorings. He said younger sailors started losing focus because nobody knew if they would ever surface again. Emily listened silently now, completely drawn into the story unfolding beneath the gray Atlantic morning. Reeves gave a slow breath. Then one sailor walked through the compartment, checking every valve himself. No panic. No speeches. Just calm. The Admiral finally looked directly at Elias Mercer. That sailor was you. Elias stared quietly at the harbor for several seconds before answering. Your father was braver than he remembers. Reeves shook his head faintly. No. He remembered clearly. The Admiral's eyes drifted toward the ring resting on the table once more. He told me every surviving crew member from Ghost Squadron 7 received one after the mission. Connor frowned. How many survived? The dockyard became still again. Reeves answered without hesitation. Very few. Cold wind rolled through the pier while the weight of those words settled across the checkpoint. Somewhere in the distance, a ship horn echoed across dark water like a sound from another decade. Brennan removed his cap quietly and held it against his chest. Connor noticed several sailors nearby doing the same without being ordered. Reeves looked toward Elias again. My father kept trying to locate you after he retired. Elias gave a small shrug. No reason to. There was every reason. Reeves stepped closer now, his voice carrying quiet emotion beneath years of military discipline. You saved his life. Elias looked uncomfortable hearing it spoken aloud. Men looked after each other back then. Reeves nodded slowly. That is exactly what he said. The Admiral glanced toward the command staff waiting silently behind him. You know what else my father said? Nobody answered. Reeves looked back toward the old veteran standing beside the inspection table. He said the bravest men he ever served with were usually the quietest men in the room. For the first time all morning, Connor Hayes lowered his eyes. Not from fear, from shame. The young officer looked toward the old scratched ring again and realized he had spent the last hour speaking to a man whose history carried more weight than every rank standing on that dock combined. Cold wind continued rolling across Dockyard 7, but the pressure that had dominated the inspection all morning was gone now. What remained was something quieter, heavier. Sailors stood at attention along the pier without being ordered while gray Atlantic fog drifted between cranes and stacked cargo containers. Admiral Nathan Reeves slowly turned toward his command staff, his face calm again beneath decades of military discipline. The inspection is terminated for today, he said. One commander blinked in surprise. Sir, we still have 3 sectors left to review. Reeves answered without raising his voice. Then they will still be there tomorrow. No one argued. The Admiral looked towards Senior Chief Brennan next. Clear the dockyard lanes. Brennan nodded immediately. Aye, sir. The old chief moved quickly now, but not with panic. With purpose. Within moments, sailors along the checkpoint corridor began stepping aside, opening a clear path through the center of Dockyard 7. Lieutenant Connor Hayes stood motionless near the inspection table, while men and women he had supervised all morning quietly shifted their attention away from him and toward Elias Mercer instead. Connor swallowed hard. For the first time since earning his commission, rank suddenly felt very small. Admiral Reeves looked toward Elias. "Sir," he said respectfully, "would you allow me to escort you personally?" Several officers nearby visibly reacted to the word sir. Elias seemed uncomfortable hearing it. "That is not necessary." "It is," Reeves answered gently. Harbor wind rattled chains hanging from a crane overhead while the destroyer beside the pier groaned softly against its moorings. The Admiral reached toward the old metal case. "May I?" Elias hesitated briefly before nodding once. Reeves lifted the case carefully with both hands. Not like luggage. Like history. Connor watched the moment in silence. Emily Carter noticed the expression on his face immediately. The young officer looked shaken now, not because he had been embarrassed publicly, but because he finally understood the size of the mistake he had made. Reeves began walking slowly through the cleared dockyard lane beside Elias Mercer. No speeches. No ceremony. Just two aging sailors moving side by side beneath the gray Atlantic sky. And then something remarkable happened. One sailor standing near the loading cranes quietly came to attention as they passed. Then another farther down the pier. Then another. Within seconds, the movement spread naturally across Dockyard 7. No orders were given. No commands shouted through speakers. Men simply straightened instinctively as Elias Mercer walked past them. Some removed their caps. Others stood rigid beside stacked equipment crates with silent respect written across their faces. The only sounds came from gulls circling overhead and the steady cry of wind moving across steel and seawater. Connor felt his chest tighten, watching it happen. He turned slightly toward Brennan. "Did they all hear the story already?" Brennan shook his head. "No," Connor frowned. "Then why are they standing like that?" Brennan looked toward Elias moving slowly across the pier beside the Admiral. "Because sailors know when they are looking at one of their own." The dockyard lane stretched toward the Waterfront Administration Building, where dark command vehicles still waited with engines running softly in the cold air. Reeves walked beside Elias without rushing him, carrying the old metal case himself the entire way. Emily noticed several younger sailors, watching quietly from nearby maintenance platforms. None of them knew every detail. Most had probably never heard the words Ghost Squadron 7 before that morning. Yet somehow the atmosphere itself carried the truth. Respect moved through the dockyard without needing explanation. Halfway across the pier, Elias slowed slightly and looked toward the harbor water. Gray waves rolled against the concrete barriers while fog drifted low above distant ships. "Place looks different now," he said quietly. Reeves smiled faintly. Most of the old submarine docks were rebuilt after '98. Elias nodded once. "Still smells the same." The Admiral laughed softly under his breath. "Yes, sir. It does." Connor lowered his eyes again, hearing the answer. The title sounded completely natural coming from a four-star admiral toward an old man in a faded jacket. That was the part he would remember most. Not the salute. Not the canceled inspection. The respect. Brennan stepped beside Connor quietly while sailors continued standing motionless along the pier. "You learned something important today, Lieutenant." Connor stared toward Elias Mercer disappearing slowly through the dockyard corridor. "Yes, Senior Chief," he answered softly. "I think I did." The afternoon light over Dockyard 7 had begun turning silver against the Atlantic water by the time Admiral Reeves escorted Elias Mercer toward the Waterfront Administration Building. The harsh pressure of the morning inspection was gone completely now. In its place stood something quieter and far more powerful. Respect had settled over the base like fog rolling across the harbor. Sailors remained standing along the cleared dockyard lane even after Elias passed them. Some were young enough to barely understand the Cold War stories they had overheard that day. Others had spent decades in uniform themselves. But every one of them recognized the same thing when they looked at the old veteran walking slowly beside the Admiral. They were looking at a man who had carried the Navy through darkness long before most of them were born. Harbor wind swept across the pier again, lifting the edges of Elias's weathered brown jacket while gulls drifted above the cranes in the fading gray sky. Admiral Reeves still carried the old metal case himself. Neither man spoke much as they reached the edge of the waterfront parking area, where the black command vehicles waited quietly with engines running. Finally, Elias stopped walking. Reeves turned toward him immediately. "Is everything all right, sir?" Elias looked out across the water for a long moment before answering. "I used to know every sound this harbor made." His rough voice carried softly beneath the distant cry of gulls. Back then there were submarines lined across every pier. Reeves followed his gaze toward the Atlantic horizon. "A lot changed." Elias nodded once. "It is supposed to." The Admiral stood silently beside him while cold sea wind moved across the dockyard between them. Behind the two men, sailors still remained at attention without instruction. No one seemed eager to break the moment. After several seconds, Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded letter with softened edges from weeks of handling. "Archive Division sent this," he said. Reeves accepted it carefully and read the heading. His jaw tightened slightly. "Automated processing request," he muttered with visible disappointment. Some office clerk probably never realized whose records they were requesting. Elias gave a faint shrug. Young people cannot remember what nobody teaches them. Reeves folded the letter again slowly. "That changes after today." For the first time all afternoon, a small smile crossed Elias Mercer's face. Tired, quiet, genuine. Admiral Reeves looked toward the old ring resting inside the metal case. "Will you allow the Navy to preserve these items properly?" Elias glanced down at the faded photographs and weathered artifacts resting inside. "Pieces of another lifetime. They belong here more than they belong in my garage." Reeves nodded respectfully. "They will be protected." Elias closed the case gently. "Good." The Admiral hesitated briefly before speaking again. "There is one more thing." Elias looked at him calmly. Reeves stood straighter now despite the wind pulling against his overcoat. "On behalf of the United States Navy," he said quietly, "thank you." The words were simple. No ceremony. No cameras. Somehow that made them stronger. Elias lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "Take care of the young sailors." Reeves gave a slow nod. "I will." Across the parking area, Lieutenant Connor Hayes finally stepped forward. The young officer looked different now than he had that morning. Less polished. More human. Harbor wind moved through his uniform as he approached carefully and stopped several feet from Elias Mercer. "Sir," Connor said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Elias studied him for a moment. Connor continued before losing his nerve. "I judged you before I knew who you were." Elias shook his head gently. "No, Lieutenant." Connor looked confused. Elias glanced toward the rows of sailors still standing silently along the dockyard lane. "You judged me before you knew who I was carrying." Connor followed his gaze slowly. The history, the sacrifices, the years nobody saw. Understanding settled across the younger officer's face at last. Elias gave him a small nod, then turned toward the old pickup truck waiting near the security gate. Admiral Reeves handed him the metal case personally before stepping back. The old veteran climbed slowly into the truck while cold Atlantic wind rolled across Dockyard 7 one final time. Then, as the engine started softly beneath the fading gray sky, every sailor along the pier came to attention together. No order was given. No command was spoken. Elias Mercer paused briefly behind the wheel, looking out across the harbor one last time before raising 2 fingers to the brim of his faded Navy cap. Then the old truck rolled quietly through the gate and disappeared into the evening fog beyond the dockyard, while hundreds of sailors remained standing in silence long after he was gone. Some men leave the Navy. The Navy never leaves.